Uh, it is an emergency how utterly awful today was in terms of economic policy. Trump has created something, you might call it an emergency, but it's basically a phenomenal blunder. Now, why did he use the word emergency? Because that's the only way that he can do this himself. A tariff is a tax. A tax is the responsibility of the U.S. Congress. Indeed, the proposal to introduce or change a tax must originate in the House of Representatives. So Trump's use of the phrase emergency is a gimmick. It's a gimmick that allows him single-handedly to wreck the international trading system. Otherwise, what Trump has done today would have to be done under the U.S. Constitution by a congressional act. The fact of the matter is Congress would not do such a thing, or it would take a little bit of time so it could be utterly ridiculed along the way and most likely stopped through the ridicule. As long as we have one person rule in the United States, which we have because the Congress is quiescent entirely, it has seemingly given up all responsibility to our president. As long as we have one person rule, we have the possibility of this kind of utterly profound blunder. On the substance, no. There was no emergency yesterday or today that remotely justifies handing such extraordinary power to one person, and in this case, one person who understands nothing about what he's doing. No justification whatsoever. Well, that's exactly the claim. The claim is, again, fatuous. It's a complete misunderstanding. A trade deficit means you're buying more from abroad than you are selling abroad. It doesn't mean anybody is ripping you off. It means you're spending more than you've earned, and maybe there's a justification for doing that. Maybe you're spending too much compared to your income. So you have to look, but per se, a trade deficit has nothing to do with actual trade policy of the other country. Now, this is also quite interesting. The idea that Trump claimed before yesterday was that the U.S. would impose reciprocal tariffs. The idea was if another country puts on a 10% tariff, we would put on a 10% tariff. If the country puts on a 20% tariff on us, we would put on a 20% tariff. In other words, our tariff level would reciprocate what the other country is doing. What happened yesterday has nothing at all to do with what the other country is doing in its tariff policy. In fact, the first words of so-called explanation, the methodology by the U.S. Trade Representative's office, which purportedly made this calculation, is, oh, we don't know what the other country's doing. That would take a long time. We can't figure out what they're doing. So we're just going to assume that if we are running a trade deficit with another country, they must be ripping us off. Not that we see that they are, or that we measure that they are, or that their policy, in fact, is doing that. We're just going to say that if we're spending more in another country than that country is buying from us, they are ripping us off. Well, it is Alice in Wonderland, what was said. There's nothing reciprocal. There's nothing about other countries. We spend more on goods abroad than other countries spend on ours. Most importantly, because we run huge budget deficits, so our government's like a giant credit card for the American people. It borrows massively, trillions of dollars. And that means that it's putting out lots of purchasing power, more than it's taking in. It's doing that by running up debt. And that purchasing power is used by American businesses and households to spend. And the result is that they spend more than America produces each year. What's the gap between how much we spend and how much we produce? It is exactly equal to our trade deficit. Not close, exactly, because that's what the trade deficit is measuring. And more than that, it's exactly like you go shopping on your credit card, you run up a debt, and then you blame the merchant that sold you the goods. They're ripping me off because I'm running a deficit with them. This is exactly what it is. We buy from abroad and they're ripping us off. How do you know they're ripping us off? Because we're spending more than they are. Honest to God, it looks like an AI fake, frankly. Is that really someone talking, or is that stringing together a bunch of words that absolutely mean nothing? So again, the charge, look what they're doing to us. The grievance, look how terrible. What does she know about where jobs went, why factories close or don't close? The fact of the matter is, you go to a factory that is producing and it has robotics producing in the factory. That's where jobs went, in millions of jobs on the assembly line. Didn't go abroad. No one victimized us. No one tricked us. You go to an automobile plant, there are fewer workers because there are robots on the assembly line.
But somebody's making the robots.
No, but it's not even that. It's just the jobs. The jobs are right there before your eyes. The machines are doing them on the assembly line. It's not that somebody else has stolen that work. That is what automation is and what it absolutely did for millions of jobs in manufacturing. Well, look, for the entire country, it's going to make Americans poorer. It's actually going to make the world poorer, because when there's international trade, both sides gain from trade. We buy things that are relatively inexpensive of other countries to produce. They buy things that the United States produces with a comparative advantage. It's called gains from trade. It's a concept I think Donald Trump doesn't understand, that actually in a deal, both sides can gain. And if you stop that kind of exchange, both sides lose. And what's interesting about today, not a surprise, but since Donald Trump single-handedly is trying to blow up the international trade system, stock markets went down everywhere. It's not like the U.S. stock market said, oh, now we win, we're not getting ripped off. No, the United States shed trillions of dollars of market capitalization today. Oh, so you say, oh, it went abroad, they won. No, trillions of dollars were lost abroad too, because both sides, the U.S. and the rest of the world, lose when there isn't trade. That's something I think Mr. Trump doesn't get. The idea that you can have a benefit from exchange, not a winner and a loser. But well, the basic point here is that throughout the manufacturing sector, it's not only automobiles, you'd find it in every single sector. U.S. production is part of global supply chains, sometimes, often from Canada and Mexico under the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada free trade arrangement, the one that Trump renamed, but also from many other places in the world. And that means that when tariffs are imposed, industries now have higher costs for their inputs. If our industries were actually exporting their goods to world markets, they're getting squeezed by these tariffs. They're not getting protected by these tariffs. Even if they are selling into the US market to US consumers, their input prices are going up steeply. The idea that these tariffs are a protection for US manufacturing is a very naive idea, given the fact that our industry is part of global supply chains. And there was a quite careful study recently published of Trump's tariffs put in place in 2018 and 2019, because this is the first time that Trump has put in tariffs. He did that in the first term also. It turns out that higher tariffs in a given industry was predictive of lower employment of that industry, not higher employment as he predicts, because the higher tariff really signified higher input costs. And it also signified, by the way, retaliation in that sector by other countries as well. So our auto industry or any other industry that is supposedly facing protection may face a bit of protection from competitors of finished goods, but is getting hammered with higher prices for inputs and will be hammered with retaliatory tariffs on exports from our sector. Now, when the researchers studied net, what happened in 2018, 2019 with the manufacturing tariffs, were they protective even of American industry, no matter the higher prices that others paid? The answer was no, not even that. A higher tariff on a given industry led to lower employment of that industry, because the two negative effects that industry faced higher input costs and that industry faced more retaliation abroad dominated any direct benefit. All of this is to say, this is maybe a lot of jargon, but this is to say that Trump kind of put a stick in the spokes of a pretty intricate machinery, and this is why all over the world the market valuation went down, because we've just seen a huge hit, not only to U.S. production, but to global production from this. It's a mess. And nobody with basic economic understanding would have done this. And if it were not a one-person show in the United States now, if we had a Congress, if we had a process, if we had deliberation, this kind of thing would have been stopped a long time ago. The fact is, the president says emergency, no matter what, and suddenly has the individual ability to really mess up the economy. I think that it was his idea, and then the aides run around like crazy to try to justify what the boss said. There's nothing reputable about any of the documents. There's a document from the U.S. Trade Representative's office showing how these crazy tariffs were calculated. I wouldn't pass a first-year undergraduate student with a paper like that, much less someone responsible for a $30 trillion economy. There were no grown-ups there. Nobody. This is a fake. The whole approach, the calculations, the so-called methodology, and in fact, the entire claim, including of that spokesperson, that this is reciprocal, that this is the golden rule, as she said, that this has something to do with what the other country is doing. They say in the first sentence, we don't know what the other country's doing, so we're just going to assume that they're doing something bad if there's a trade deficit of the United States with that country. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. What's happening is Donald Trump is succeeding in uniting the world against the United States. And we've actually seen this in recent weeks, some in anticipation of yesterday's actions, though I have to say yesterday's actions were far worse, far weirder, far more arbitrary, far stupider than anybody imagined. So let me be clear about that. But there has been, of course, for weeks, the feeling that the United States is not a properly run country and that things are not in control. And what is happening is that other countries are changing their partnerships. They're discussing among themselves, we can't go on this way. For example, Korea and Japan, which purportedly are on, quote, the US side, met with their Chinese counterparts and said, we really need to strengthen our relations together. Now, that's fine with me because they should, they're neighbors. So I have no problem with that. But that was provoked by what we just heard from a Japanese official. That was provoked by the fact that the United States is utterly unreliable from their point of view. We've had, by the way, again, a good thing in my mind, but a warming of relations between China and India. This too is coming about because both countries understand there's some weirdness going on in the United States, and so we should really be on normal terms with each other. This will lead to a warming of relations between Europe and China. The United States, in other words, is just standing alone. No friends in this anywhere. Not our neighbors, not Europe, not Japan, not Korea, not anybody, because this is an assault on a basic system of exchange in which the world operates. And this assault does damage to everybody, starting with the United States. We had the biggest stock market decline because the impact is most negative of all in the United States, but it's negative worldwide. And so that montage is really a very clear demonstration of that fact. There's growing expectations, of course, of a significant downturn in the US. There's absolutely should be growing expectations that America's long-term competitiveness is being deeply eroded by this. Like it or not, we're handing the leadership in the world economy over to China by creating a high-cost, inefficient base of operations because normal trade, normal supply chains, normal division of labor is being broken because Donald Trump in his fervid imagination thinks the rest of the world's ripping off the United States, and he can't understand that we've been on a credit card binge, and that's why we're spending so much abroad. And if he would properly do the job of the US president, he'd get our budget under control. But he doesn't want to get our budget under control. He wants to give massive tax cuts for the richest Americans again. So all of this is going to be compounded by a bizarre set of actions in the coming weeks where Congress, at the bidding of the president, not only will double down on this economic destruction of value that we just had today, but is going to slash the health benefits of the poorest Americans, the most vulnerable people in our country, to try to make part-way room for yet more massive tax cuts for the richest Americans in this country. It's not going to solve any problem. The budget deficits are going to remain huge. The trade deficits are going to remain huge. We'll just all be a lot poorer and we'll be living in a much harsher environment. That's what's, well, I think, first of all, if The first remedy is the one that the founders of the Constitution envisioned back in 1787. Remember, they were responding to a king, King George III. That's who provoked our revolution starting in 1776 because Britain imposed taxes on the United States without our representation. Well, Trump has just done the same thing. There's been no representation in the US Congress. We just had a king who declared an emergency and then single-handedly broke up the world trading system with all the damage to the US economy. So the first remedy is, my God, somebody in Congress could do their job. Somebody in Congress could read Article 1, Section 8 of the US Constitution, which gives Congress, and only Congress, the authority to levy duties, tariffs, taxes. That's their job, not the job of the President of the United States. You read Article 2, the President of the United States has no power to levy taxes, and tariffs is a kind of tax. And this declaration of an emergency is so phony that, of course, this is a blatantly unconstitutional action. So the first thing is that members of Congress, if they had any decency and any gumption, would stand up and say this is completely impermissible. And members of the president's own party should be saying this, because their job is not subservience to a king. Their job is to represent the people of the United States, and they're not doing it. Now, a second possibility is the Article 3 part of our government, the courts. Businesses that are suddenly asked to pay Mr. Trump's taxes should go to court, and I presume that many will, to say the president has no authority to levy a tax on us. Every word of the executive order, every claim of the executive order that this is an emergency, that this is a harm created by others, which is a major argument of the declaration of the emergency, is laughably false. And so I believe that these tariffs will be challenged up and down the country in the courts. And I think that what Trump has done will be found to be illegal eventually. So this is a second remedy. The damage to the United States, to the economy, to the reputation of the United States, to our foreign policy, will be extremely severe. But we're not at the end of this story, even in terms of the application. The whole executive order, from my point of view, is phony. He says the president with the powers vested in me, he doesn't have those powers. There is no legal justification. And the fact that we have, I think, rather atrocious legislation on the books that allows for these declarations of emergency does not mean that you get to use the word whenever and however you want. Judge, you read the definition in the statute, and that absolutely does not apply in the current circumstances whatsoever. So I do think that in the end, well, who knows whether our political system continues to function, but if it does function according to the principles on which it's established, these tariffs are not only horrible policy, but they're plainly illegal, and I would say unconstitutional, because they're an assertion of power by the executive branch, a power that lies exclusively with the legislative branch.